If you really think about it, the Christianity we know today is very different from what Jesus, peace be upon him, actually taught. In the beginning, his followers didn't call themselves Christians. They were simply Jews who believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah. They still followed the same laws. They kept the Sabbath, avoided pork, practiced circumcision, and prayed to the one God of Abraham. Jesus himself said in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." That's pretty clear. His mission wasn't to start a new religion, but to revive the same pure monotheism taught by Moses and the prophets before him. But then a new figure appeared, Paul of Tarsus. He's often called the Apostle to the Gentiles, and he's one of the most influential people in Christian history. Born around 5 AD in what's now Turkey, Paul was originally known as Saul. He was a strict Pharisee, highly educated in Jewish law, and even a Roman citizen. Quite a powerful combination at that time. At first, Paul hated the followers of Jesus, peace be upon him. The book of Acts describes him as a persecutor of early believers, even helping in the execution of Stephen, one of the first Christian martyrs. But everything changed according to Paul's own story when he was traveling to Damascus. He claimed that Jesus appeared to him in a vision saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" From that moment, he completely transformed and began preaching what he believed was a new revelation. Here's where things get interesting. Unlike the original disciples, Peter, James, and John, Paul had never met Jesus in person. Everything he taught came from what he called revelations, and his interpretation of Jesus' message was very different from that of the disciples in Jerusalem. While the original followers still observed Jewish law, Paul began preaching that belief in Jesus alone was enough for salvation. In his letters, especially Romans and Galatians, he wrote that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. To put it simply, he taught that following God's commandments was no longer necessary if you believed in Jesus' death and resurrection. This was a complete shift. The original disciples, led by James, who was actually the brother of Jesus, didn't agree with this at all. They believed that faith and obedience to God's law went hand in hand, just as it always had since the time of Moses. But Paul took a different path. He began traveling across the Roman Empire to Greece, Asia Minor, and Rome, spreading his message to non-Jews or Gentiles. Between 46 and 57 AD, he founded communities in places like Corinth, Ephesus, and Thessalonica. He wrote letters to these groups, giving them guidance, and those letters, known as the epistles, later became part of the New Testament. Now imagine being a Gentile in the Roman Empire at the time. The Jewish law seemed complicated: no pork, circumcision, strict dietary rules, and a Sabbath you couldn't work on. But Paul came along saying, "You don't need any of that. Just believe in Jesus' sacrifice, and you'll be saved." For many, that was a far easier message to accept. But not everyone was convinced. Around the year 50 AD, Paul met with the main apostles in Jerusalem, Peter, James, and John. This meeting, known as the Council of Jerusalem, was a big turning point. There was heated debate about whether Gentile converts should follow the Jewish laws. Paul insisted they didn't need to. The apostles reluctantly agreed to a compromise, but it was clear there was tension. Paul later admits in his letters that he argued with Peter, even confronting him publicly. So yes, Paul did physically meet Peter and James, but their relationship was far from smooth. James, the brother of Jesus, continued to lead the original community in Jerusalem. He and his followers, often called the Nazarenes or Ebionites, stayed faithful to Jewish law. They saw Jesus as a prophet and Messiah, but definitely not divine. Meanwhile, Paul's version of the faith, centered on Jesus' death, resurrection, and divinity, began spreading like wildfire across the Roman world. Then came another major shift. Paul started teaching ideas that were completely new to Jewish belief. In his letter to the Philippians, he described Jesus as being in the form of God. He also said Jesus' death was a sacrifice for the sins of all humanity. This idea, salvation through the blood of a divine being, wasn't part of Jesus' own teachings, but it did resemble the sacrificial rituals of pagan religions in Rome and Greece. Paul's teachings became the bridge between ancient pagan beliefs and what would later become mainstream Christianity. Over time, his followers adopted more of these cultural elements, such as the celebration of Jesus' birth on December 25th, which aligned with pagan sun festivals, and the idea of divine sons and trinities that were common in Roman mythology. It's important to remember that Paul's letters were written before any of the four Gospels. Scholars date his writings to around 50 AD, while the first Gospel, Mark, wasn't written until about 70 AD. That means Paul's theology shaped how later authors understood Jesus. In many ways, Paul set the foundation for what Christianity became long before the life of Jesus was even documented. Even Christian historians admit that Paul was the real architect of Christianity as a global religion. The theologian Albert Schweitzer once said, "Paul did not destroy the religion of Jesus, he made it universal." But others argue that Paul's changes were so drastic that they created a completely new faith, one centered on Jesus rather than the God Jesus himself worshipped. From the Islamic perspective, this is exactly what the Quran clarifies. Islam teaches that Jesus, peace be upon him, was a noble prophet who called people to worship one God. Allah, the same God of Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad, peace be upon them all. The Quran says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 72, "They have certainly disbelieved who say, Allah is the Messiah, the son of Mary. While the Messiah said, O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord." In other words, Islam restores the original message, pure monotheism, free from the later additions that came through figures like Paul. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the original followers of Jesus lost their influence. The center of Christianity shifted to Rome, where Paul's version took dominance. By the 4th century, Emperor Constantine adopted it as the official religion of the Roman Empire. The councils of Nicaea and later councils formalized doctrines like the Trinity, original sin, and salvation through crucifixion, none of which were ever taught by Jesus himself. So when we look at history honestly, we see two very different messages. The message of Jesus, peace be upon him, was about obeying God, following his commandments, and living righteously. Paul's message shifted that focus to belief in Jesus himself as divine. Over time, that became the mainstream version of Christianity we know today. But through Islam, the truth of Jesus' real mission is preserved, that there is only one God, and all prophets were sent with the same call, to worship him alone and live by his guidance. If you found this story insightful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Islam with Aslan for more engaging deep dives into history, faith, and truth. Together, let's uncover the past and reconnect with the pure message of God that has stood the test of time.